the pace of change around what we put on the grid. So electric vehicle adoption, electrification of heating, and then the increase in the number of people who want to have some sort of local supply and control, so like solar and storage, is going to outpace our ability to upgrade every one of those transformers.
In today's episode, we speak with Josh Brumberger and Marissa Hummon, the CEO and CTO of Utilidata. They're on a mission to maximize the efficiency of a decarbonized energy grid. We discuss the inherent challenges of change in a highly regulated legacy system, the importance of knowing your stakeholders, and what it means to build an outstanding team. Welcome to Beyond Innovation, a series that breaks down the mystique, explores what works, what doesn't, and what innovation really means with experts who live it every day.
Super excited about having both of them on. Two brilliant people whom I've had the pleasure of knowing for about a year and a half, having worked with them firsthand to see just how much they can accomplish in a very complex space. So I'd like to introduce our two guests. We have from a company called Utilidata, Josh Brumberger, who is the CEO, and Marissa Hummon, who is the CTO. So welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us. So I'm going to push it back to you guys to kind of give us a little background on both of you. So Josh, why don't you get started? Give us a little sense of your story from where you were to where you are now.
Sure. No, I appreciate it. And thanks for having us on. And I appreciate Marissa, joining me. I think, as we think about innovation, a lot of it is really how you engage with each other internally, right? And how you project that out to the external world. And so I think having us both here, hopefully will give, the folks that are watching and listening to this, some of that, a little bit more in-depth look at how we really process this stuff. So anyway, Josh, I'm the CEO at Utilidata. I've been at the company for about 8 years now. I was the chief commercial officer. And when we think about chief commercial officer, and we'll get into this a bunch in terms of what we mean, but we're in a very heavily regulated industry. And so we think a lot about policy and regulation along with the sales and marketing. So I was chief commercial officer for the first 4 or so years. In the last handful of years as CEO. Prior to joining Utilidata, I was the deputy treasurer in Rhode Island. And so I have a background that's been in and out of politics and government services and financial services. And so really what sort of drives me and what I love about Utilidata is there's this sweet spot of technology, commercialization, and policy. And you got to hit the middle for us to do this thing right. And that's what we're doing. And so I think my background in policy and politics and in government, I'd done everything from presidential campaigns to working in a large hedge fund and private equity fund. I think it puts me in a pretty good position to hopefully do this, fairly well, which really involves all these multi-stakeholders coming together. Outside of work, I love to spend time with my family. I love to ski. So hopefully, when I can figure out how work allows me to do some of those things, it works well.
That's great.
Marissa.
Thanks, Josh. And Justin, thanks for having us. So I started at Utilidata about 3 years ago, and it's kind of the third leg of the stool of my career. How can we get to a decarbonized future, safely and at least cost? And the thing that I honed in on there was that we need a lot more flexibility out of the system, that the way we run coal plants and natural gas plants and even nuclear plants all require us to have really long-term plans about those operations. And as more people put solar on their roof or add an electric vehicle to their household or maybe even add a storage device, the idea that the way people use energy is very predictable, that doesn't hold anymore. And so the kind of final question I answered at the National Lab was, well, what's the value of those devices, things like solar and electric vehicles, if they were responding to the grid as opposed to just being a taker from the grid, what could they do? What's the financial value in that? And the answer was, there is some, and now you got to go figure out how to get it done. And so after NREL, I went to another software company and did behind the meter optimization. So we think of the meter as kind of the dividing line between everything that is not owned by the utility, so owned by a customer, building owner, and then things that are owned by the utility. And so I worked on how could we automate things that are behind the meter to participate in the grid. And again, we figured out we can do that. Customers are interested in both from an economic and a philosophical standpoint of supporting the transition to a decarbonized grid. But the missing link is that there is a physical wire running from your house to some sort of box. It's either on a pole or underground. And then those go all the way back to a substation and then to a big power plant. And those wires were built for one-way power flow, right? We just push power out, and they were overbuilt so that we didn't have to monitor them. Right? We didn't have to look at them. Occasionally things blew up, but other than that, we built for the 40-year plan. And the types of technologies that I was interested in building and deploying that could support, us, massively adopting solar and wind, needed two-way power flow and needed that section of the grid to be a whole lot more flexible and dynamic. And so I came to Utilidata, and that's because in this space, Utilidata is incredibly unique in having gained the trust of utilities to run the power system between the end of the line, the customer, and the substation, and that's the missing link to kind of, in my mind, to kind of getting us through the big transition. So.
Got it. So can you guys give us a little summary on Utilidata as a company at sort of a high level, and then we're going to drive into the sort of overall mission. But give us a sense of what Utilidata is, what it does, what it promises, etc. Josh, why don't you take a stab at that?
Marissa, you did a great job. You already started with that in your intro. Which is great. So I think, at our core, we're building an AI-driven distributed energy platform that makes the distribution grid, those poles and wires, more efficient and more resilient, and ultimately able to ingest the countless distributed energy resources like solar and wind and batteries and EVs that are going to get thrown on it. I think everyone's preparing, and everyone's pretty good at preparing for linear change, but I think this is going to be exponential change. And so building the type of modern software platform that will enable the grid to ingest, make use of, and turn all those new resources that will come online available, right? That's what we really aim to do. And so we work with big utilities like National Grid and American Electric Power. We work closely with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, with DOE, with state agencies. And so really it takes, a broad group of stakeholders to come together to instigate change. And so, as an organization, we build really great technology, and we'll let Marissa talk a lot about, what that technology is and why we've made some of the choices that we've made in terms of engineering it. But we also spend a lot of time thinking about the commercial drivers and the policy drivers, right, to ensure that technology finds its way into the field. So, what does Utilidata do? We make, phenomenal grid edge software, but we really understand the commercial and policy motivations that allows that software to find its way to scale.
So in the time that I've gotten to know you guys over the last 18 to 24 months, like, I know I've learned a ton about what I have always just taken for granted, right? Like we come home, we flip the power on, you have this expectation that that power is going to be there, it's going to deliver in the way that you expect it to. Unless you've been to a country where the power is not reliable, it's really hard to relate to the actual reliability of the system that's been built here. It's an easy thing to pick on because it is pretty inefficient in ways, but at the same time, it's hyper reliable. I mean, I have had the pleasure of traveling to India and seeing what that looks like. That's a different grid. It doesn't behave the way that ours does. I've spent lots of time in China where you're sitting in a factory and the lights go out and you don't know why. So as we've worked together, I have learned a lot about this mission and this idea that you guys are on to sort of redefine the grid edge from a technology perspective. And it'd be great to get that from your side, because as a consumer of power, sometimes it's we're sort of shielded from all this effort that goes on to keep that thing running the way that it does. And then the energy, no pun intended, required to move it, to change it, which is enormous because of the legacy systems that we've built over the course of 100 years now that are just one piled onto the next and piled to the next, and you can't break it. So Marissa, you want to just give us a sense of how you guys see this redefinition of what we as consumers feel is something that we take for granted, or most of us anyway take for granted.
Yeah, it's a really good point. When I first started working on the grid, I did not believe that when you turned your light switch on, that a generator had to like consume a little bit more coal or a little bit more natural gas to put out more power. I was just like, no, that's just like, that's ridiculous. But that is true, right? So, and across a whole area, when everybody does something simultaneously, that's like the utility's worst nightmare, right? So
right.
Take electric vehicles, for example. If you and your neighbor and the rest of the people who are all connected to the same kind of distribution equipment, a transformer, if we all buy electric vehicles, we all put them in our garage and we all plug them in at the same time, that transformer is not set up to handle that, right? Just
right.
It wasn't part of the vision when that transformer went in. Mine's from like 1960, right? So that wasn't on the horizon.
Right.
And I think what we are facing as a community in the United States and even more broadly as part of the global community is that the pace of change around what we put on the grid, so electric vehicle adoption, electrification of heating, and then the increase in the number of people who want to have some sort of local supply and control, so like solar and storage, is going to outpace our ability to upgrade every one of those transformers, right? Like, I heard someone from the EU say they didn't have line of sight to enough copper and steel to match the rate of electrification progress. Like there wasn't an option to build their way out of it, that they really did need to engage in management technologies, right? So that's software. So Josh said our business is taking digitized information from the grid and AI and turning the grid into something that is flexible and reliable and able to, accommodate the customer's whim. I don't think the expectation of the customer in the United States is going to change much. I think we continue to expect a reliable grid, a safe grid. And frankly, I don't think that if you buy an electric vehicle and get it home, that it's going to be acceptable for the utility to say, oh, wait, you can't charge that here. We can't accommodate that. And so, and utilities, I think, are on board with that. And the question is how do we, what are the steps that a utility takes and a technology company take in order to move us forward? So we've been focusing on the edge of the grid because that is the least visible and the most dynamic. And the thing that is going to encounter the most number of new resources or new problems. You talked about the edge of the grid in your prior, as you sort of introduced this. Can you just give us a really clear definition of the starting point and ending point of the edge of the grid? What is that
defined as?
We define the edge of the grid as the end of the line for the utility and the beginning of the line for the consumer. So
Okay.
typically that's at the meter. For your solar system, that's at the inverter.
Okay.
And that demarks what is, both the line of responsibility, but also the line of, of value, right? So the utility is responsible and can create efficiencies all the way up to the meter. And you are responsible for the wiring inside of your house and how efficiently you use power that gets delivered to you.
Got it. Okay, that's great. So I hadn't
Justin,
heard that. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, one, I think build on to what Marissa was talking about, because I think there's the way of looking at the edge that Marissa just described. But if you think about the power grid, you've got generation, then you've got transmission, which is incredibly high voltage, and then you've got distribution, which is the lower voltage, right? And so it's that distribution system that when we talk about digitizing the edge, it's not just that link between the customer and the grid, but it is the entirety of the distribution system, because that's the part of the system that has the most sort of chaotic rules, because there's 50 different states that have 50 different rules, and there's all sorts of different jurisdictions. And so the distribution grid's kind of the wild, wild west, but that's where all the new, interesting, exciting technologies are going to be layered on, and where all those customers sit that are used to plugging something in and having it work, right? And so the distribution grid as a whole is what we're looking to bring up to create that connective tissue so everything at the edge can happen.
Got it. It's interesting. It's a great example of how the two of you, with your two different backgrounds and your two different perspectives, sort of merge together to create a single answer, because I feel like Marissa's point of view is from the technical side, the scientific side, and your point of view is from, like, for you to just say quickly, we have all these states that have to deal with this and they're all managed differently, all different rules. Like for us as consumers, like, we don't think about that, right? I live in Rhode Island. Massachusetts is, I think I'm like 3 miles from Massachusetts border. I don't know if the power that we get is the same power that is transmitted to the people who are 3 miles up the road, but the policies are probably different.
Have you ever attended a public utility commission hearing? It's your right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
I mean, next time I'm really having trouble sleeping, I'll go. It'll be great. It'll be phenomenal. So I also heard something that I hadn't thought of before. I spend a lot of time in the supply chain. We do a lot of supply chain work. And Marissa, you saying that the EU pointed out that they don't have enough copper to manage what is coming is something I hadn't even considered. So can you just sort of dig into some of the other obstacles that we're facing as we navigate from, we'll call it a less smart grid to a smarter grid, number one. And then number two, we are seeing ever increasing requirements and usage of energy as we grow in population and we grow in, I mean, I'm in a room right now. I don't even want to, even though it's all LEDs, I'm pulling a lot of power right now. I got 4 cameras, 4 lights, 2 computers. This is new for us. So can you just talk about what those obstacles look like as you navigate from the technical side? And then I think we move it over, Josh, and you do the same from the other side of that picture.
Yeah, and I think both sides are really important. As Josh pointed out, the fact that while electrons behave the same in all 50 states, people do not, and the policies are not the same.
Right.
So from a technology perspective, there are places in, even in the United States that have run out of room for solar, right? But the definition of run out of room, while you would imagine it's very straightforward, it's not straightforward, right? So, the amount of visibility that you have to what's going on the grid changes dramatically your ability to manage to handle more solar. And the same thing is true with electric vehicles. My statement about running out of copper or steel or transformers, it isn't very hard to imagine. So for the last couple decades, we've had very low load growth to zero load growth in the United States, which means that mostly we've been, fixing things, but we haven't been building lots of new things. With electrification of heating and transportation, it's somewhere like 30-50% increase in consumption of electricity.
Whoa.
And to build a new substation to deliver that generally is a 5-year process, a couple of years of planning and siting, another 1.5 years of waiting for parts to be built, and then maybe another 6-12 months to get it actually built. So we haven't had to do that for a long time. And we have not ramped up or figured out how to ramp up that supply chain of that equipment and that skill in a way that's going to meet the projected sales that GM and Ford and Tesla have for their electric vehicles. So the alternative is to add a layer of intelligence to the grid, which has been definitely, this word smart grid has been overused over the last 10 years. But it really is, we need every point on the grid to be communicating better information and be able to make decisions about what should happen locally in order to support that. So, my transformer can't handle every person who's connected to that transformer plugging in an electric vehicle at the same time. But most electric vehicles only need to charge for 2 to 3.5 hours. So we can spread this out, between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. amongst us, but there has to be a level of coordination. And there's no way to do that right now. Frankly, if I have 2 electric vehicles in my garage and they aren't the same make, I can't even get those 2 to talk to one another and balance the 40 amps that I can deliver there, successfully. And so that's, I think, the big technology problem we're facing is we won't be able to upgrade the grid fast enough. We can't build we can't build infrastructure fast enough to accommodate this. And the alternative is to make what is there smarter and run better.
Got it. That's crystal clear. That's great. So Josh, same sort of question to you. What do you see as the challenges then for moving this thing forward as you guys try to create a more intelligent version of the grid that exists today?
Well, so there's a bunch of challenges. I think that there's a legacy infrastructure that we talked about. Marissa referenced 60-year-old transformer or transformers from the 1960s. There's also the business model is as old. Right. And so we're not just, trying to catalyze the adoption of new technology. We have to catalyze the adoption of new technology through a new business model, right? Or else it's not going to happen. And why is it not going to happen? Because even if we were amazing as a society of planning for the future, which we are not great at anymore for a whole host of reasons, the project that Marissa just described to upgrade that substation would and will take a long time. It also happens to be incredibly expensive, right? And so I asked you earlier in the podcast, when was the last time you had been to a public utility commission? And I was joking, but there was a reason for the question, right? Because that's where those decisions are made in these quasi judiciary, pretty intimidating proceedings that if you were to show up at, you would feel lost and overwhelmed, and you probably wouldn't want to go back, right? But that's where the decision is made in terms of whether you're not going to upgrade that substation. And so everything they look at is what is the benefit we're going to provide today. So it would be very hard to get approval and acceptance for building something that we think we're going to need in 5 years, based on projections that everybody doesn't currently agree on. Right. And
makes
so
sense.
one thing that we need to do is kind of rally around the fact that we need to start building for the future. Right now, what we do as an organization, I think fairly well, is to look for use cases that have a real value today, real meaning today, something that we can talk to you or the Public Utility Commission or a utility about why this will drive additional value today. But the trick is build it in such a way that is the foundational underpinning for what you know you're going to need to build 5 years from now, right? And so is distributed edge computing an absolute must for certain use cases today? Probably not. Will it be for the use cases we envision over the next 5, 10, 25 years? Absolutely. So how can we wrap it in a cost-effective package today that will allow the technology to be deployed so it's sitting and waiting to be utilized for the more advanced use cases? That's the trick, right?
Got it.
And in order to do that, you've got to get a lot of stakeholders to buy into that because it is not what we've done in the past.
It's funny because in if you talk to, just take a generic example, let's use Windows as a generic example. I've never worked for Windows. I don't know that what I'm about to say is true or not true, but I surmise that they have strategy meetings where they project out 5, 8, 10 years, like most big technology companies. And they try to, and the term that we've all come to know is future-proof. We're trying to future-proof our technologies so that we can build on them for the future. And it sounds to me, if I'm hearing what you're saying, like that is not thought of in the same way in the utility sector as it pertains to public policy and the way that we plan for the future in that arena. Whereas in the space that you guys live in your day job, right, which is a part of the innovation space, the space that we live in, we're always trying to say, okay, well, if I do this today, like what are the downside consequences for tomorrow? And it sounds like that's a little counter to the way that the system works today, where it's a little more about what am I doing right now? What am I doing right now? What am I doing right now? Am I interpreting that correctly?
So I don't think people that spend their days in the system would necessarily agree.
Probably not.
But I think it is hard. I think the system is not created to reward folks for taking risk. And what you just described is there's risk inherent in making a decision based on something that you anticipate to happen in 5 years, but don't know with certainty, right? So if you've got an entire ecosystem that has been built around not taking risk, it becomes harder to do what you just described. So I don't, as an organization, it's very easy to come into this space and say, why don't utilities do this faster? Why don't regulators do this faster? Like, why, what's wrong with us? I think most people, are well-intentioned, but like breaking out of the mold that we're in is really, really hard. We have to do it, but it's really hard, right? And so as an organization, we got to try to find ways that like get us into the mold so we can break it, right? Because just an outsider walking in there screaming to the Public Utility Commission or utility about like how great our technology is, that in and of itself ain't going to do it, right? And so I wouldn't necessarily agree with exactly how you worded it, but there is an element of it for sure.
Yeah, so it's a good segue into how we see innovation within this space. I mean, everything that we talk about in this podcast is trying to ground people in actionable things that they can take forward that build towards something in the future that sort of moves the needle. And in the space that you operate in the energy space, we typically only hear about the really big, really long projects, things like offshore wind, big solar. I mentioned before the podcast started that I had just heard this piece on modular nuclear power plants that sort of gave me a funny feeling. And so, Marissa, why don't you just take on like, what does innovation mean in your world? And what are the processes and steps that you guys employ to start to move the needle in the space that you are working in, considering the constraints, because you can't just pretend like they're not there.
Yeah. I think this is where kind of the structure of our company and we have one mission, but kind of three avenues, right? So commercial policy and then the technology side. We can't go build technology in a vacuum, right? Like if it doesn't have a way to be commercially adopted and it doesn't have policies across states that support the adoption of that technology, it doesn't matter, right? Especially if you're working within the utility space. So I think, for example, we have software that's been running on the grid for 5-10 years that makes energy delivery more efficient. So on average, we can take 3% of the energy off of your bill, off of the grid.
That's a lot.
It's a lot.
That's a lot.
Imagine just doing that across the whole country. Wow. We just saved us a lot.
Yeah. Wow.
With really good data, you can get to 5%. So basically, if you have to guess at what's going on, you can't be quite as aggressive, but if you know what's going on, then you can get to that 5% energy savings.
And this is all just through managing what? Like, how are you managing this so that you get those kinds of outcomes?
You're managing the voltage at the substation and along the line. And again, like the reason it was a little high to begin with and caused a little more energy consumption is that the edge of the grid, the end of the line, wasn't visible. And so to kind of hedge your bets, you put out a little bit more voltage. Yeah. If you can see everything, then you can lower the voltage at the substation and save everybody, 3 or 5% on their bill. But the underlying technology there, while it was about lowering voltage for energy efficiency or to improve delivery, is the same piece of technology that we need in order to add more solar to the grid or in order to add more electric vehicles to the grid. And so innovation on the technology side means, to me, finding the current use case that has policy, regulatory, commercial backing, right? And putting that on top of a technology that is going to be future-proof. So, we can turn on add more solar in our software really easily because it's the same piece of technology. We just talk to solar more often than we did previously, right?
Right.
We talk to the solar devices, but that core piece of technology is there. That's my take on what innovation is for the space.
Josh, what's your take on what does innovation mean in the arena that you guys operate in?
No, I think that's right. I think it's understanding that there are multiple stakeholders that all have to come along for some part of the journey, right? Like if a utility is wildly excited about something, but the regulator doesn't understand why it's important, it ain't going to happen. If the regulator is wildly excited about something, but the utility, can't get their head around how they're going to make money, it ain't going to happen. If inside the utility, an engineer loves something, but the C-suite doesn't get how they're going to get paid, it ain't going to happen, right? So there are all these variables, and you just can't let anything get too far out of whack. Right. And so as long as you can keep that sort of gap narrow enough, you can bring people along. And so that's always the challenge, right? How do you excite people about the future? Because we do is the lucky thing we have, in terms of being entrepreneurs and innovators is we can talk about the future, right? And we can talk about what that vision is. Now we have to put together, a cogent piece of technology and narrative that we can deliver today, but they do look to us to, better understand where things, may be going. And so ensuring, and this is really hard, and we're not, we are certainly not perfect at it, but we try to get better every day, but ensuring that there is a message that is relatively consistent to each of those parties, so nobody falls like too far behind or races too far ahead. That's what it takes to innovate in our space, right? So we're actually fighting for the chance to innovate the way I think most people think about when they hear about innovation, right? Like if you just unleashed Marissa's brain on the 10, 15, 20-year problem right now, like it would be solved, period,
Right.
full stop, it would be solved. But just, that's just not reality, right?
No.
And so we have to get folks there. And so I think we grapple with it a ton, right? And I think that is one of our innovations, which is like our willingness to grapple with all these meaty topics that we're talking about.
I agree fully. And I think that like what you're saying, for those who work outside of the energy sector, the rules are the same, the names are different. You can't pretend like you don't have constraints. You're trying to build something that has to fit a pre-existing, predefined system. You don't get to make all the rules. I don't care what you're building.
That's right.
There's always a rule book that you have to know and follow in order for you to succeed. And if you try to ignore that rule book, we end up in a lot of projects where, people say things like, well, let's just ignore cost for now. Let's not let that encumber us. And our answer is always like, yeah, but if you ignore cost, then eventually the thing's going to be too expensive and nobody cares. You're in the same boat where you've got all these constraints that it's almost like having your eyes open going in is the only way for you to know that you can be successful, because you're then not blindsided by some constraint that you thought, oh, well, if I can just ignore that for now. So I want to talk.
Let me just one thing, Justin, but you can't ignore the constraints, but you also cannot allow yourself to be captured by them.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the healthy push-pull
And I think so long as you go in knowing that they are there, that doesn't mean you have to say, okay, well, I can't do this because.
That's right.
But you have to at least be aware of the fact that I have to convince that other person who's on the other side of the table, who's got a totally different point of view, that what I'm bringing isn't going to break the mold. It's going to break this thing, especially in your world where like that light switch better turn on when I flip it.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
No matter what that 3%, 2%, 5%, when I hit the switch, turn the lights on, please. And that's a constraint that's real. So I want to talk a little bit about how you guys have forged partnerships. One of the things that I've learned from you guys, and something that I think you guys have done a really good job at as a company, is sort of pull from resources that are outside of your entity. In the world of big technology companies, you guys are still a pretty small company. You're reaching into places that are very big with huge companies that are involved. And I just want to have you guys expand on that a little bit and talk about how you've leveraged partnerships to be able to do all this, because where you're headed is fascinating and complicated, and it requires lots of brains with lots of experience. So Marissa, why don't you sort of give us a sense of what that means for you guys?
Yeah, I think, again, I'll take it from the technology perspective, and Josh, you're welcome to expand on it. Partnerships for us are incredibly important because what we do really well is we write software that can operate the grid. When we started wanting to work on a distributed compute platform for, basically putting that grid operations software very close to edge devices like solar and storage and electric vehicles, we realized, well, we're not experts in microprocessors. We're not experts in that, like the actual hardware layer. And the IoT space is a good 10 years old. And so there are experts in that. And we announced in December a partnership with NVIDIA to build kind of the heart of what you need at the edge of the grid to understand what's going on. So we take in meter data and on-site compute what you need to, and then make decisions locally and talk to devices locally. The local part of that is important for two reasons. One, there's latency in the system. So if you want to go to the cloud and have your compute done there and then come back, it's oftentimes too long to really make a good effect on the grid. And that's in particular, that was what was one of the qualifications that our partners at NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, had, right? So the third part of that partnership is that NREL has a way of coordinating devices to operate better together, but they need that to sit on a distributed local computation platform. So NVIDIA and Utilidata are going to come together, and what we coined as the smart grid chip is a combination of, fairly off the shelf standard, IoT hardware and measurement hardware, plus a software layer that Utilidata writes that is kind of the foundation for grid operations and that exchange of information and value between devices and the grid. And then on top of that, NREL will be able to put an application that demonstrates how, if this distributed computation platform existed, look at all the possible value streams that become available to consumers.
And that computing power on the edge is there because do you need to manage things in true real time? So as something turns on, it turns off, you're listening and making decisions. And that's why you can't, because I think most people in our sector would say, well, why aren't you just pushing all that to the cloud and just do it all in the cloud?
Yeah. And there's definitely a role for the cloud, but the distributed computation piece is really meant to take the sub-second decisions. And then, the second part is when the cloud's not available, the grid still has to operate. And so having a local layer does make a lot of sense from creating that robust system.
This comes back to that constraint of it's got to operate under all conditions. You don't get to turn it off.
Nope.
And it has to run no matter what. So Josh, on the partnership side, from your side of the business, give us a sense of sort of how that works, and how that then plays into the strategy that you guys are taking as a company as you start to really blow out Utilidata as an organization. What does that look like from a partnership perspective, on sort of more of the business and strategy side?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things. One is, partnerships are just inherently hard, right? Because, they feel really, really good, at first, and then you actually got to get into the mechanics and who makes money, how do they make money, who's got what special sauce and the like. So, there are plenty of really, really successful people that are successful companies that are stay far away from partnerships, do everything yourself. I think from our perspective, there's a ton of fits and starts with partnerships. Our industry is littered with companies that put out press releases about doing these amazing things together that go nowhere, guilty as charged, right? We are not immune from that, but we are striving to find partners that we do recognize in each other a uniqueness that, absent the other, will just take a lot longer and probably won't be as successful. And if you go into a partnership with that core understanding, you're grounded at a really good place, right? And so I think first and foremost, like Marissa just described, when we work with the folks at NVIDIA, they bring this unbelievable expertise in other industries. By the way, other industries is incredibly important because I think the mashup of what's happening with other industries coupled with what's going on in our industries actually makes us better. So when we look at partners, not an accident that we were attracted to and excited about someone like NVIDIA, who's got vast experience in other very complex industries, bringing them into the utility space, right? So that was one piece. And so I think we found that there, right? The other piece is, again, somewhat unique potentially to the industry, which is whatever the adage is about you don't get fired for hiring IBM. NVIDIA, they're both innovative, but they are, a sort of international behemoth that everyone knows about and wants to hear what they're doing. And so, when we couple with somebody like that, it allows us to go to the utilities, because us going to a utility, and we're small, although well funded in terms of counterparty risk. It's something that the utilities think long and hard about, right? They buy from folks like GE and Siemens and ABB. They're not conditioned to buy from small, nimble startups, that are managing cash flows and all sorts of other things that are going on. And so, there is in NVIDIA, everyone's kind of interested in what they're doing, right? So they bring both an incredible amount of expertise and capabilities, and it's wrapped in that, like, well, of course, if they're working with NVIDIA, they've got to have some staying power, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's twofold. And then, from our perspective going forward, from a pure strategy, we don't we want to enable as much as we do ourselves, right? And so when we think about building a true grid edge platform, part of the learnings we hope to bring, and we hope that it manifests itself in how we build the software, is that the software is not currently built for folks, edge innovators or OEMs or other companies that may potentially build, building management systems or other products. It's really hard to access the data and utilize the data and ensure that the data provides value to both the customer side and the grid side. And right, we've gone through all that. And so what we hope to do, and one of our aims, is to really build that platform to help unlock some of the value that could exist on the customer side. And it does not mean we build every application. We'll want to build some because we think we're really good and have a unique perspective, and have been running at it for a bunch of years. So think we're got a leg or two up. But we really want to level the playing field so there can be the proliferation of the market and the new technologies that we need on the other side that are going to allow us to capture the true value of the grid going forward. So that's the big thing from a strategy perspective. And when you look at it, NVIDIA happens to be great at creating those platforms that allows these incredible industries to grow. And so it just made sense as a partnership.
It's also an unexpected, in this way, it's a brand play, right? NVIDIA brings with them brand cachet. That brand cachet gives you credibility. Partnering with somebody like NVIDIA means you walk in the door to somebody else and they go, like you said, this is a trustworthy team because of this partnership. And I think that's a good lesson for anybody building any business anywhere. It's associate yourselves with people who have brand cachet in order to help enhance your own brand, because building brands is expensive. Building brands takes a long time. And NVIDIA, they're an interesting business because I think most people would still see them as new and fresh. They've actually been around for a very long time. They're very mature and they're enormous. And I'm not sure everybody's aware of just how big they are and how many places they've got their technologies layered in. And so when you really get down to it, it makes perfect sense from a technical perspective. And then it also makes sense from a commercial and branding perspective. So it's a fascinating sort of case study in building partnerships in unexpected places, but that actually make perfect sense for the businesses because you both have aligned values and aligned views. Okay, so I want to close with something that I think is really complicated and something that I know that we've talked about over the years quite a lot, which is how you structure teams to kind of get into this. And I think we can touch on this a little bit from the business model side, from the business standpoint, from the technology standpoint, because you're trying to do both. And you've got for a company that's not big, you've got a ton of complexity in your organization. And I think that is, and I don't mean org chart complexity, I mean business complexity. You've got a lot of things you have to think about in order to make all this work. That we have become a part of that family over the course of the last 2 years, and it's been really fun and really interesting for us. And I'd just love to get some insights from you guys on how you see team building, how you see resource building, how you see that influencing the business model. Josh, you said a lot earlier about how one of the innovations has to be on the business model side. And so how you structure this to achieve these fairly big goals that you actually don't have a very long time frame on. You're not setting a 25-year grid edge technology change goal. You guys have a couple of year grid edge technology change goal, which is aggressive and achievable if you can structure it the right way. So Josh, why don't you start on your side, since Marissa started the last couple times. You start on your side on sort of how you see the formation of this team strategically, and what steps you guys have taken, and what you continue to want to do as you go forward.
I was hoping you were going to ask Marissa to go first.
Too bad.
Well, actually, no, but when you were talking about the partnership, the partnership discussion we were just having, I thought you were going to talk about the partnership we have with Octo.
Well.
So NVIDIA, Octo, it's all. Right?
I'm not sure our brand and the NVIDIA's brand sort of give you the same lift. I mean, you can pretend, but
not yet. Not
yet. Anyway, but anyway, yeah. But that's been, I mean, you've used our team in a way that's similar to the way you're describing the relationship with NVIDIA. We bring something different from your side. You bring something different from our side, and it works really, really well.
Yeah, and that is, we in that regard, we really do, now that I think about it, we have a lot of consultants that feel more like an extension of the team than they do a consultant that throws a piece of work, over the dividing line there, and that is by design. Right.
That is a function, by the way, of your personalities and the way that you guys manage these relationships. That's very unusual in the sort of consulting to customer world. That's a testament to how you guys structure the conversation and how you guys manage the relationship.
Appreciate that.
That's not that easy to do. So,
well, we do it because we're selfish, right? Because it makes us better.
That's okay. That's why we all do it, right? That's okay.
Yeah. No, I think, look, you got the goal is to get the best out of everyone around you. And in our experience, like, you get the best out of folks around you by doing your best to find the right people and or teams, and then B, empowering them and recognizing, and they're going to bring a perspective you might not have, or an idea you might not have. And like, that's why you sought them in the first place. Right. And so I think we really do look, when we enter into an arrangement with a consultant, we really do look to, understand how is this also going to be valuable and exciting to them. Because the reality is they're going to want to spend, more time with us and thinking about our things. And your team's a great example. We'll get on calls sometimes and folks will come up with ideas that just hit them over the weekend. Right. And ideally that's because, the topic is engaging and they like working with the team and all that kind of stuff. So utilizing consultants in a way that is like really unifying, I think, is one thing we do particularly well. I think, we're working through this now. There's that middle spot. If the further you go on one side and deep into the technology, it's kind of safe to be cordoned off. And then the further you go on one side, deep into like the regulatory or the sales and marketing, it's okay, that's cordoned off. But most of the organization, and Justin, I think that's what you're alluding to, lives in here. Yeah. Right. And so we are, constantly poking and prodding how we structure ourselves internally, right? And one thing I don't think you create an org chart and like set it and forget it for the next bunch of years, right? I think you're rallying the org chart around outcomes you want achieved, not like what goes in a JD. Now, of course, you have to have a job description. Of course, people have to know what they're getting into when they sign up. Of course, there's got to be a clear delineate, who reports to who. But the reality is you will be successful if you are comfortable operating in that gray space. And so that may mean your direct report is someone who is different than you're working with on a day-to-day basis. And that is not just okay. That's actually potentially a great thing, because it ensures information is flowing around the organization in the right way. So I would say, I wish I could say that we had a silver bullet for it. We fumble our way through it every single day, and try to get a little bit better at it every single day. But really looking for those links between the R&D side of the house and the sales and marketing side of the house. So make it feel like it's one house. That's what we're constantly trying to do.
Something has stuck with me that you asked me a question very early in our relationship where we had just kind of gotten to know your business. We had just kind of gotten to know your team. And I don't remember the context, but it has stuck with me, which was you sort of cornered me in a meeting and said, do you guys like this stuff? Yeah. And that I have never forgotten that, because I think that's something that people don't always think about when they're entering into these relationships with whether it's a full-time job, a consulting gig, or a partnership, which is like, you better like it and it better be interesting to you, or it's gonna fall apart. And when I think about the clients that we work with, that we have the most enriching technical relationships with, those are usually the ones who are also quite excited about the work, right? And if those two things don't come together, then like it's eventually gonna wear away that enthusiasm. And I think that's an interesting way to put this, which I don't know. I hadn't thought about it in those terms. So Marissa, on the technical front, sort of give us the same feeling on how you navigate building this team so that they're poised for this future that you're trying to envisage for all of us. I think it's funny that I think about the stuff that you guys are working on, while we might not all know it, someday someone's going to listen to this and something will have happened in their house and they won't even know that you guys enabled that. That the reason why that thing didn't just do something bad or did something good is because there was a little piece of Utilidata code sitting on their grid, and it made sure that when that thing happened in their house, the good stuff happened and not the bad stuff. And that's the coolest thing to me, where it's just like touches all millions and millions and millions of people just get touched by these technologies. It's fascinating. Sorry, I got a little excited.
That's good. I think that's one of the things that kind of defines, what we're looking for when we bring people in, is that they really do need to get excited about the technology. My two things on building a team and running it well. One is that I value your problem solving capabilities and your ability to explain yourself to somebody else far more than the specific thing that you've done in your past. And actually, I have found that the people who didn't study power system engineering are, but just by the nature that they're new to what we're doing, will have different ideas. Not all of them are perfect, right? But to get difference in terms of, innovation, you really have to bring in a diverse set of perspectives and experiences. So we we really value that in terms of how we hire on the R&D side. And then I think the other thing that I've learned from Josh and from my team over the last 3 years is that innovation happens when the space is ripe for experimentation. And that means leadership has to be both very open to new things and then very good at communicating when a decision has been made. So more ambiguity there is about what we're doing or how we're doing it, the more stressed people are about trying to bring you the right rock.
Right.
And if you can clearly define periods of we're trying to accomplish something really hard, we're looking for very different out of the box ideas, and then be able to close that and say, we selected this and that's what's moving forward. That helps the team both know when innovation and creativity and brainstorming is going to be really well received. And then, once a decision is made, it helps people clarify what they're working on. And I think it helps, the team work together better. So that's those are my.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think those are I think again, it's a good demonstration of like the yin and the yang and the way you guys have thought about this, and both of you end up in this common ground of like, I have this belief that we have built a world of specialists, and the reality of the value of people who have generalist capabilities is what sort of becomes this glue between all these people who are specialists, who've got this very deep knowledge, which is necessary to solve big problems. But you need that little bit of connected tissue of people who can kind of look out of both eyes into two directions and say, okay, I think that thing you're working on, and I think that other thing you're working on, if I bring those two things together, we can do something magical. And that's, to me, like, that's where you really free people's minds and get some really fascinating things that come of it. And I feel like, again, in the 2 years that we've been working together, we've seen that firsthand. We've seen that through the partnerships you've built, through the technologies that you've built, and we haven't even been able to expose all the fun things that we're working on yet. But when we do, it'll be great. And that's another sort of interesting marriage between sort of two sides of this coin, where we came in with zero knowledge of your space, but lots of knowledge for how to make things usable in a space.
Mhm.
And I think it's nice when those things sort of align. So just as we sort of close this up, this has been super great. And again, as I have in all of these that I've recorded, I've learned a lot of things. Like I didn't know I could go to the, what's the commission called?
Public Utility Commission.
The Public Utility Commission meetings. I didn't know I could just go to those anytime I want. I might have to do this now just to see what this is like. And I think this has been excellent for me, and hopefully you guys have enjoyed it. So as we, anybody who wants to get in touch with either of you two, just give us your LinkedIn. We're going to put it in the description, but have at it. How can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, for me, my LinkedIn is just my first and last name. No symbol between them.
Okay, Josh.
Same thing, Josh.
Okay.
Brumberger. Yep.
Great. And Utilidata is based in Rhode Island, and a super dynamic, really fun organization that we've enjoyed working with over the course of the last almost 2 years, not quite at 2 years, but almost 2 years. And we're looking forward to all the cool stuff you guys bring to the market. So thanks again for coming on, and thanks for your time.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you.